Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Ed Yohnka. Ed is the Director of Communications and Public Policy for ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, their Illinois chapter. This isn't Ed's first visit. We're happy to have Ed return. He was very well received when he spoke here more than a year ago, and if I recall, on very short notice, subbing for his ACLU director. So they have a great team there. He stepped in, and we wanted him back on this very important topic. Ed Yohnka began with ACLU almost 5 years ago. He serves as a primary spokesman for this very important civil rights advocacy organization. He appears regularly, and you may have seen him, I know I have, on television and radio programs in Illinois and throughout the nation. Ed is also widely cited in newspapers and publications on legal and legislative matters related to ACLU's priorities. And I'll mention that while his topic today is very important and he's going to focus on it, during the Q&A, some of you may have other questions, and he's well able to handle those as well. So we're going to leave more time. He told me he's going to leave more time for Q&A. So on both sides of the ledger, too, to be mindful that we're a diverse community, a diverse America, and I think we need to hear from all sides. Before joining ACLU, Ed served on the staff of the American Bar Association for 12 years, spending most of that time as a special presidential assistant in the American Bar Association's Office of the President. In short, Ed is very well qualified to cover a very important topic with us this morning. Please give a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Ed Yohnka.
Good morning. I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege before I begin because nobody else had an anniversary. Tomorrow, my wife and I celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary. And I only wish she were here because she's the one you might imagine who deserves the applause, having put up with me for 30 years, and my friends and colleagues are still amazed that it happens. I want to thank Ron for the introduction and for welcoming me back. And I'm going to lift the veil here for just a moment and let you know about my appearance this morning. So last year, I stepped in for my colleague, our executive director, Colleen Connell, who had to step away from doing this program after her son was able to come home and visit before he was deployed. He's a Marine Corps captain. And so I stepped in, and a few weeks later, Ron reached out and he said, you know, we'd really, really love to have you back. And we were thinking about this topic, and we were thinking of having a law professor, and the law professor he mentioned is of someone who's a personal hero of mine. But he said, you know, we really think you do a better job making it accessible. Well, how can I say no? And then it was free speech on campus. And I'm not so sure I should have said yes so quickly, but I'm here, and we will talk about this today. Because I will just begin by saying that there's little question that our campuses have become a focal point of discussions, and really, I think, of a battle over free speech and what it means to engage in free speech in our country and on our college campuses. And I want to start with a premise, just to be abundantly clear, which is that in this time of such sort of stark divisions in our country, there are really efforts from both what we would commonly refer to as the left and the right to stifle speech on campus. Nobody's hands are clean when it comes to this effort. And I think for me that is really a shame. Because I want to start for a moment by talking a little bit about why I think that free speech is so important and why it's especially important in a college campus. You know, we talk about free speech in this way that is, I think, sometimes ethereal and often just political, right? We want the right to have free speech because we want to share our views about the government or about what the government is doing wrong or what it's doing right or what we would change or how we would do things differently or what it is that we think about a particular issue. But the reality is that what free speech is really about is personal. It is about personal development. It is about personal growth. It is about hearing a range of ideas and topics and issues that let us explore and expand and determine who we are, to find our own place in the universe, to borrow a phrase. And I suspect that, like me, many of you have a life narrative that involves developing views or exploring different ideas from what you were exposed to as a child or just in your immediate family. And a lot of times, you know, those ideas, the place where you really get a chance to first really branch out and explore those ideas is in college, is on a campus, is in an educational setting. I may have shared this the last time I was here. If I didn't, I will just share with all of you. I grew up in a community that when I was young had less than 1,000 people in it. I assure you my views today, political and otherwise, are much different than the people I grew up with. Although I want to say, and I've been really focused on this recently because I grew up in a rural neighborhood area, and forgive me just a 30-second digression. There have been a series of op-ed pieces and others that have talked about the differences in people living in rural and urban communities. I now live in Chicago. And I'm much more struck about how much similarity there is in people. We all love our family. We all want some life better for our children, and we all want our communities to be better. There is much more that unites us than divides us. And it's why I think it is so critical, whether on a college campus or elsewhere, to be able to explore the places where we're different. Because I fundamentally believe we will never find common ground. We will never bridge whatever these wide divergences of opinion are if we don't talk to one another, if we don't listen. And part of free speech is listening. And we forget that. So for me personally, one of the places where I first fundamentally began to understand the importance of differing views and listening to people and considering different experiences when I was at college. I went from a small town high school where there were 100 kids in my graduating class to my very first lecture at the University of Illinois being more than 500 people. The professor, a really wonderful man who I later got to know quite well, came out in shorts and a t-shirt with a microphone and said, you know, in his first lecture, screamed out, "Here's your notebook," and shook the textbook and threw it across the stage and said, "If you can't keep up with my lectures, I don't give a bleep." And all I could think is, you are not in Kansas anymore. But those experiences of spending time with people from different countries and different backgrounds and different experiences and different ideas, and certainly different political ideas than my own, were really formative. But I want to talk about a really important and for a kind of seminal moment for me when I was in college, and I'm going to reveal my age, which I feel a little more comfortable in this room than most of the ones I'm in. But I want to share a moment, which was that I was at the University of Illinois in 1980 during the Reagan-Carter campaign. And in the fall of that year, later President George H.W. Bush, then a candidate for vice president, came to Illinois to give a speech. Can you imagine that, like, Illinois was a state where they were competing? But he came and went in, a friend of mine and I we went to this big hall. I will reveal I was not supporting the Reagan-Bush ticket. But we went because we wanted to hear the speech. And so he gave his talk, and when he was done, they opened it up for Q&A. And the first person who had stood at the microphone for a half an hour to be there to ask a speech began to ask him questions about his time as the director of the CIA, and had a number of questions or things that he wanted to raise, some of which, were things that had been revealed during the church committee hearings. Some things, I think, to be fair, may have been a little more conspiracy theory minded, but it was a range of things. And a number of Republican Party officials who were in the front of the room, who were there, began to hiss and boo and chide the person for asking the question. And the future president said, no, let him ask his question. And I was struck by that in that moment, to think about the fact that you have enough confidence in your view and your belief in your experience to let someone challenge you like that. And I've always thought about that in terms of, I've been in lots of situations where, shall I just say, working for the ACLU, people don't agree with me. But the other element of it was to think about, in that room, there was not just one perspective being offered, that there was at least another idea or sensibility being offered. And I thought about how important that was, especially on a college campus. And what's really sad to me is that in the 44 years since that moment, so much of that has changed on campuses. And we tend to think of this as something that has happened recently, something that is a new phenomena. Others at least do that, or it's the way the narrative often gets portrayed in the media. But I think that reflects the fact that we have a short attention span these days, and we don't recognize the way in which speech on campus has gradually been limited and gradually changed over these last 40 some odd years. And so I want to talk for a minute about that and how we sort of got to this moment where we are. In the 1980s and the early 1990s and into the 2000s, students on campuses across the country protested, demonstrated, debated around a range of different issues. There were demonstrations during the Reagan administration about foreign policy and nuclear power, especially, or nuclear weaponry, especially the placement of nuclear weapons, aggressive nuclear weapons in Europe. There were issues that were raised around South African policies around apartheid, and especially whether or not the government of the United States should be supporting the South African government, whether or not companies who were doing business with the South African government should be part of investment schemes by government agencies, including universities and university funds. And of course, moving forward, there were discussions and debates over things from LGBTQ rights, and then on into the Iraq War and the issues that evolved around torture and other things in the wake of 9/11. These were things that often happen on college campuses. And of course, one of the things that students most often tried to do was to ensure that their message was getting to the leaders of the university, that they were getting the most coverage, the most attention, having the most eyes and ears on their protests. That's, after all, the role and the goal of a protest, right? And so they would quite often focus these demonstrations in and around the administration building for a university, in and around the Quad or the Greens area, or some central location like the student union that would often place the message right at the footsteps of those who led the university. And on a range of these issues, I would say that university officials would often look the other way, would say all the right things about free speech. But when the issues increasingly began to get focused on both the internal operations of the university, was it safe on campus? These questions about policies of investments. When the board of trustees for a university was targeted about something, the administration tended to get a little bit concerned. And so what we began to see was the development of two things. The first were so-called speech codes on campus. And in the early days of those speech codes, they tended to be that the codes tended to revolve around how one could speak in terms of attempting to petition or advance an issue with the university administration. They didn't tend to try to sketch out or to limit in some ways the kinds of issues that people were talking about or the way they were talking about them, but simply sort of the model for how one petitioned the university leadership. But the second thing that we saw during this time, and I think what became, sort of that first canary in the coal mine, as it were, around speech on college campuses, was the development of so-called free speech zones, right? So there would be a place on campus where any demonstration was allowed. But that tended to be, in many cases, quite far away from the administration building and from that general sort of gathering place on a university campus that most people wanted to target. And the rules that were put in place in many institutions were that if you were going to engage in a protest, you had to do it in the free speech zone. If you didn't do it in the free speech zone, then you were subject to discipline or, in the extreme, arrest. One hopes that that would never take place, but that's where these would go. And these were challenged. These free speech zones were challenged. And generally speaking, the courts looked at them and said that it was okay for a university to set aside a place where speech could happen and deny it in other places. And the reasoning of the courts tended to be that if you had demonstrations happening, for example, in the Quad area or the Greens area with university buildings wrapped around it, that students who were in classes might be disturbed by them. I will just add a footnote here. I tended to be disturbed not by demonstrations, but by warm, sunny days when I was in the classes around the Quad. Probably still would be to this hour, if I were lucky enough to be back there. But they said that as long as the university was doing this on a content neutral, that is, no demonstrations, no pro or con a particular issue, that this was okay as long as everybody was required to go there, and only limited in those cases where where the speech zone was placed so far away from any reasonable population of the university that those organizing the event could, not really reach their intended target. And that's the way that these zones began to demonstrate. I still think that kind of failed the fundamental test of what I think about often, or what many of us think about in terms of free speech on a campus. Because candidly, again, one shouldn't be able to be shielded from views that are being expressed by others, even ones that are different than the ones you have. And so throughout much of the 90s into the early 2000s, we saw these zones, we saw demonstrations moved away from them. And so that was something that we saw quite often. As we moved into the 21st century a little further, we began to see another set of challenges to speech on campus. And this is where I'm going to say that these were largely challenges that were brought by progressive voices, liberal voices, the voices on the political left. And I think that, probably many of you have heard of at least one or two instances like this, but you'll understand what I mean. Because in those early 2000s, what we saw and experienced across the country was a number of kind of, I don't want to say controversial, but more theatric, conservative commentators. Think Ann Coulter or someone of that ilk, began to schedule college tours across the country. And the idea was, for many of these commentators, that they were going to take the conservative voice and take it directly into, the mouth of the lion, as it were, or the belly of the beast, for liberal, progressive institutions like universities, and they were going to go and speak in these places. And often these people were invited to speak not for a commencement of the university, but by some university group. The Federalist Society at the law school would often house and host many of these speakers. I think for many of us, we can think about this. I personally would not cross the street to see Ann Coulter speak. That's me. Maybe some would. But for some students, what happened was this very visceral, emotional reaction, which seemed to suggest that because they disagreed with the content of these speakers, that those speakers should not be permitted a place on campus. And that's wrong. That's just wrong. And I think one of the things that was really troubling about this time period was that many of the students who disagreed with this speech, I think there are a couple of things. Number one, they couldn't distinguish between the fact that a group of students who simply held different views than they did wanted to have this speaker, which should be their right. They should be able to hear from anyone that they want. And the second piece was they thought that the university was sponsoring or supporting or approving of the speech of the person simply because it was taking place on campus. And again, this inability to distinguish between the university as just a neutral forum for all voices and the university somehow putting their thumb on the scale of having a speaker whom someone disagreed with really set off a flashpoint for many students. And we saw a number of, I think, for me, very uncomfortable and troubling instances in which people actually physically acted to disrupt the speaking. So you would have students who would take control of the stage and not permit someone to go on and speak. You would have students who would, pack a room and hoot and holler so that no one ever heard the voice with which they disagreed. And I find this troubling. Protest leaflet outside of the event? Absolutely. Hold a counter event somewhere on campus in which you bring a speaker or express yourselves the reasons why you vigorously disagree with the views of the person who's there? 100%. But disrupting or not permitting someone to speak on a university campus because you disagree with them is something that I think should trouble us all, and really runs afoul, again, of this kind of idyllic, principled sort of position that, I'm afraid I still carry, that we should somehow only be here and only have to hear the voices with which we agree. And the result of these protests, the results of these activities tended to be a raising up and rewriting of many of these speech codes at major universities across the country, oftentimes in a way that allowed what has been traditionally known as a heckler's veto on speech on campuses. That is to say that if someone disagreed with a speaker or disagreed with their message, then the university would find a reason not to include that person or not to have their voice heard. Again, something that I think is antithetical to kind of basic free speech theory. And if you think about this, we have depended upon not giving in to the heckler's veto when it came to protests, oftentimes that many of us supported. I often tell the story, if you remember, in 1968, when Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago and wanted to march in Marquette Park to talk about segregation in housing, the then Mayor Daley said he couldn't because there were people who were opposed and there was threats of violence. And the courts, of course, said, no, he has to be permitted to march and you have to provide security for him. That is the way that we have traditionally gotten over these things, instead of writing codes that allow people to disagree, suspend, or block someone from speaking on a campus. And I think it did a disservice in a number of different ways. I will just observe personally, it obviously made a lot of these speakers sort of martyrs to the cause. It allowed them to suggest that there was this great intolerance on the left, and candidly, sometimes there was. And it really, it also gave this space to university officials to create even stricter speech codes, which ended up working against those very speakers later in other instances. And so that second development is the thing that we saw through that time. And again, I think it kind of fails this test of what at least I want as an ideal. So I want to skip forward to the fact that obviously in the last few months, we have seen a lot of debate and discussion about speech on our college campuses across the country. And I think that I want to suggest that what happened before sort of helped us get to where we are now, specifically after the attacks in Israel on October 7th and the resulting military action in Gaza. Number one, I just want to acknowledge that these events create very strong feelings on all sides. We know that. And we also know that they bring out the worst in people in terms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And neither one of those things adds to our discussions about those events or about world events generally. But I'm afraid that the experiences that I've described before, especially in years preceding, have led to a situation where students somehow believe that they don't have to have voices that are different than theirs on campus. And if they do hear a voice that's different than theirs, that it creates a circumstance in which they are unsafe. Now, I want to distinguish that from circumstances where people have been unsafe, where that exists, and though violence and threats are not speech. And we should always distinguish between and among those things. And the other element is, of course, that when people are actually making physical threats directly to people, those things are not covered and should not be covered by any concept of free speech. There isn't a speech code in the world that you can write that will, stop somebody from making a threat. That has to be dealt with as a separate event and entity. But what worries me most in this moment is that, again, what we see are university officials who use these disagreements and the back and forth about these issues as ways to crack down even further on all speech on college campus, which isn't approved by the university. And so, we see these places where on a college campus, and we've happily seen examples across the country, even since October 7th, where scholars from different backgrounds and representing different perspectives actually bring people together for conversations. They don't always successfully bridge every difference, but they show that the way to addressing issues, to thinking about policy, does not come through shouting, it comes through conversation. And where better to do that on a college campus? But instead, what we see are universities that block people from demonstrating on, whatever side of the divide one might be on. And in extreme cases in the state of Florida, we've actually seen efforts to bar student groups on the basis of their beliefs and on the basis of their affiliation. And again, we should never use the power of government to limit people associating together or to limit, their ability to gather together. And I think that, the other reality that we have to deal with is that these attacks on speech on our college campuses are now being used for a host of other reasons, right? And a host of other causes, because there have been strong disagreements about issues around Gaza and Israel. We've seen efforts on the part of some universities to block discussions of race and DEI issues in the United States. Those are now labeled as too controversial. There are efforts to block people from hosting demonstrations on behalf of political candidates because those may bring a strong reaction from those who oppose those political candidates. And I think that what we've done by being less tolerant is create an environment and a permission structure for even less tolerance, which I believe hurts us at the end of the day. We also just will mention quickly, we also see these attacks on universities as being the homes and the places and the resting places of all, a host of liberal bias, right? We've all heard those terms. It's, liberal bias, there's too much and we're indoctrinating students. I am reminded that professor that I mentioned who came out that first day I was at the University of Illinois and tossed the textbook across the stage used to tell me, Yohnka, there's only one damn place in this university where people are being indoctrinated. It's over at the business school because they won't teach Marxism. Crack me up. I used to think, I don't think they're going to. I think we can just move on. But I think that it really undermines the kind of principled idea of campuses being a place of an exchange of ideas, of being a place where we can share differences in ways that are nonviolent, and a place where we can share and exchange and allow people to learn and to grow. And that really ought to be our goal. I said this earlier, but I want to close here. We have big differences in this country. There are things about which, people have, where in some ways, and it makes me shudder to even think of it, where people even question the value of democracy and voting and elections. I think we ought to talk about that less, not keep those people from speaking. I think we ought to understand why people feel that way and try to find those differences. I think institutions of higher learning are a great place to begin those discussions, but at the end of the day, I think it's also all of us who need to be part of that. And so This is obviously just a little bit of a primer and a sketch of sort of where we've been, and I'm afraid in some ways where we're going. But with that, I am going to pause to thank you for being here and to say that I promise you I will answer any questions that you have, and I will try. I think I promised this last time and didn't keep it. I will try to be short in my answers this time.
Thank you all so much. Arnie, I want to ask Ed a question before we take questions from the auditorium. I think we'd all agree that in America, we have a divide, and it's a toxic divide.
Yeah.
Why would colleges be any different? In other words, if we have a society where the differences are not seen as you have a point of view, I have a point of view, I'll respect your point of view, I differ with you, let's reconcile it if we can, let's try to do something together, almost as a family would. So there is an American family, just as we have our own families and our differences. So if there is this toxic divide and the kids are just patterning it, the colleges are, how do we address that? Is that addressable, or is it time going to take care of it? And I try not to make it political, but it sounds that way.
It does. So let me say, I think to your first sort of inference, I think colleges should be different because college is meant to be a place that's different. College is not meant to be a place where there are answers so much as there are just more questions. And I think if we can get to the point where on both college campuses and elsewhere, we're asking those questions, I think that's the space we ought to be in. I want to say one other thing about the point you make, and I agree with what you've said. You know, I just want to say, I don't know how many of you have the same experience I have where members of your family hold divergently different political views than you do. I think we are all experiencing that these days. The thing to me that is most important is that I don't ever think less of them as humans because they have views politically that I don't agree with. I don't know where we go if we start thinking that someone is not worthy or valued in our family, whether it's our family, they're the family of our country, if in fact we don't view them as being worthy of having a discussion with. I know there are some who throw around words and act like that's something we should not do. I'm not willing to give up on that personally.
Thank you, Ed. Arnie, would you please take questions from our audience?
Thank you very much. Taking a bit of a step back, can you tell us what the differences are, or are there differences between the right to free speech on a public and a private university?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question and a distinction I should have made earlier. So thank you very much. Remember that a public university is bound by all of the prescripts and the requirements of the Constitution. So they are held to a much higher standard in terms of providing a neutral space where every voice can be heard and not rewarding or punishing speech depending on its content as the result of the fact that they're a public entity that gets public money that has a public trust in that way. Private universities have fewer restrictions on that, although because of often their geographic situation, the space where people may protest or voice their opinion or et cetera may be on public space. That is, there may be a park, there may be a sidewalk, there may be a pathway or a roadway that is public that is connected to the university. All of those rules really do apply to those physical spaces. But again, in terms of who they allow to speak, how they do it, what those rules are on campus, they can really set their own rules as a private institution.
Hi, I actually worked for the ACLU in 1968
Wow.
during the convention. And now we have another convention coming up in Chicago this year. And so I'm wondering what the ACLU hopes, how it may influence or in some way play a role in what we know is going to be a very interesting and hopefully not too combustive event.
I fear you may be reading the email I send to my colleagues virtually every week about these issues. I think there's three things that we hope for, and we are informed in thinking about these three things by both the experience of 1968 and the experience of 1996. And so let me say just briefly, the first is that people who are seeking to protest and want to speak to the convention goers, to the delegates, need to have spaces that are close enough to the delegates and proximate to where they will be, so that those delegates who are the intended target can hear the message. So what we are hopeful for is that the city, the convention organizers, and the national security folks, because this is a national security event and the president of the United States will be there, et cetera, will permit spaces for protests that are close enough to the United Center in order for those people who are protesting, whether it's about abortion rights or LGBT rights or, you know, whatever the issue is, to have access to at least convention goers being able to know that they're there and recognize their message. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there are people who will want to protest at other sort of designated or recognized Chicago landmarks. A classic one is because of the Picasso statue, people often want to be present and have the ability to have their voices heard inside Daley Plaza, because when that video is shown around the world, everyone recognizes that as being part of Chicago. So what I anticipate is that there will be lots of discussions, including lawyers for the ACLU with the city, about permitting events at those locations during the course of the event. And the final thing, and we saw this a little bit with the NATO meetings in Chicago a few years ago, are the people who will want to march around the downtown part of the city. And I think, again, with some planning with both the event holders and conversation with the city and federal authorities, I think we'll get the ability for people to be able to move around the loop, for example, and march in the evenings while the convention is going on, et cetera. There'll be lots of, you know, this will be a continuing conversation because of concerns about ample personnel for security, the fact that the many of the attendees will come back to the loop area. So I think those things will be happening. I'm sorry, Ron.
Yes, and we have a question from George, who is going, I've unmuted, who's on Zoom.
Okay.
George, please ask your question.
Okay, I'm wondering what you think. You've concentrated on speakers and on protests. And I'm wondering what you think about the effect on individual students who have contrary views and on the breadth of the learning experience in classrooms in a university who have too many professors, a high proportion that might be progressive or that might be MAGA, you know, in either case.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a really good question, George, because I wanted to focus on the idea of speech in terms of the campus generally. But I think the classroom issues are really critical. They're also really detailed because they tend to devolve, I should say, into a kind of a specific fact set. But to pick up on George's point, I especially in a public university, again, taking your public-private point, I think that a student's worldview should not influence the assessment of their academic work. And I think that most professors, I want to say, I think most professors can distinguish between those two things in the context of somebody being able to provide supporting material in order to make their point. So I think somebody who, for example, I will just use this this example because I was actually talking to a professor recently, who said that it's one thing if a student wants to argue to me that reducing taxes will cause the economy to grow. There are ways in which one can make that case. One can write that case persuasively. One can do that. As he said, I don't happen to believe that. I understand why, based on my life experience over my adulthood. But that is that there is an argument to be made. There is a way to make it. There are sources to cite. There are things that one can do. That whether or not the professor agrees or disagrees with the perspective should not in any way affect the assessment of the student's academic work. But the second element of that is that, on the other hand, I think a student who wants to write a case claiming that the 2020 election was rigged and stolen has a much tougher burden, right? That's not a perspective. These are about facts. And I think that's where the difference comes in terms of just that kind of the general assessment of their work. I think in terms of, their comfort level or feeling of not being able to express themselves, I think those are very individual matters and ones that really end up being about the individual and the relationship that the individual develops both with classmates and with the teachers and professors themselves. I'm going to confess that coming from a very small rural conservative community, that the professor that I mentioned who threw his book across the thing and complained about them not teaching Marxism, he and I did not always see eye to eye. I'm not really shy. And so he knew that we didn't see eye to eye. And we developed a friendship over that. That's not going to happen in every case. And that's not the way that's always going to work. But I think, again, there's an important role that educators have in this in terms of making their classrooms a space where ideas can be shared and discussed and different opinions can be shared without someone feeling like they're being picked on or oppressed or et cetera. And I think that's where we get into the really important difference between, candidly, there is a difference in saying the sky is blue and saying you're an idiot because you don't think the sky is blue, right? That those kinds of personal attacks set apart from the kind of global part of this, I think is the really important thing to keep in mind.
I'm just wondering what your interpretation is of the three women presidents of universities when they were in front of the Senate or the legislature.
The House,
yeah. What's your take?
I think for people who are incredibly smart, I think that was the dumbest testimony I've heard in my adult life. And I say this, I shouldn't say that. And I've given permission for them to broadcast this, so I'm sure I'll hear from somebody. But I just first of all, it wasn't an honest question, right? Let me just say, it was not an honest question, but that doesn't matter. Because here's the thing. If somebody was chanting for a group of people to die, I want to talk to those students if I'm the university president. That's the very first thing I say. I want to know why they would feel the need to do that. And I don't care what the code says. I don't care what the First Amendment says. If I'm the leader of that university, I want to know, why do you think this is a place where that's permitted? We're calling for someone to die. And I think, to me, to try to parse out the legalese of that, this is the one place where maybe you're better, Ron, not having the law professor. I think trying to parse out the differences between the law and court decisions and et cetera is just not the right answer there. And it just felt to me like somebody who got overcoached to go into that hearing and didn't just act like a human being. The first thing I would say is, of course it hurt people. Of course it did. And I'm sorry to those folks, and I found them too, and I apologize to them that happened at my university. And the second thing, I'd want to talk to the perpetrator and say, what are we doing here? How is this advancing the cause, right, wrong, indifferent that you have? And I would try to figure that out. And that would have been my answer. I just thought that was just a horrific moment for academics. And I really, and again, I think what troubles me is again, 3 people flubbed an answer in a moment before a hearing of a House committee. I don't know if you remember the tobacco executives all swearing that tobacco or that smoking didn't cause cancer. I mean, it's not the worst performance, it turns out, in the history of Congress. But the fact of the matter is that it allows these other sort of things that kind of tear down and attempt to deconstruct the value of education. That's what really worries me. Because, if we aren't in places where we're trying to learn and grow and develop and find new ideas, if we're only going to accept, what certain people say or certain things, that's where all of this falls apart in terms of this experiment we're part of. And so that moment, I'll just say, as a communications, I like to think professional. My colleagues might differ on that some days. But, as a communications professor, God, that was a horrible set of answers.
I really enjoyed your discussion of what's been happening at college campuses over the last 40 to 50 years.
You can stop there if you want to, by the way.
Very good. As the ACLU, that is frequently portrayed as an overly liberal, progressive organization.
Yeah.
Thought of taking this thought on the road to colleges and universities to really spread the word of how things should be done.
So one of the things that my colleagues at the national office did in the wake of it's interesting, in the wake of recent events, was to send an open letter to university presidents and leaders all across the country, sort of articulating these principles, not with so much detail about the history, but just the principles. For better or for worse, the one example they cited in the letter of things happening currently was the efforts in Florida to try to ban pro-Palestinian groups and have them lose their charter. And of course, the letter instantly became fodder in that discussion back and forth. I will say, if they had asked my opinion, they didn't. That I would have left that out, because to me, it's these kind of general principles and ideals that are way more important. But in terms of a campaign to just go out and do that, I hope that, I've done this in recent months on college campuses. I'm hoping that my colleagues and other affiliates across the country are doing that. I would really welcome the opportunity to do it, because I do think that it really matters. And I think, most of all, I return to this, is that I just don't think we ever bridge any divides. I don't think we ever get anywhere if we don't just shut up occasionally and listen to other people.
I'm going to ask one question. Well, we'll go to you, sir. Why don't you ask your question first? Go ahead, please. Take the mic. Point it to your mouth.
One of the things that has bothered me as I've seen the kind of back and forth is that it becomes very difficult to meet in the middle when one side is very extreme and the other side is not so extreme. The average is not fair and is not helpful. And so when some of the very, very strong kinds of attitudes that are expressed in a very negative way, as we've seen just in the last couple of days, that doesn't improve the public discourse.
Yeah.
I want to add on because my last question is directly tied into what this gentleman just said. And I'll add on to it in this way. Back in the day, and when we say that, this group knows what we're talking about. Okay. Back in the day, there was common ground on facts. Let's assume that Walter Cronkite didn't give us opinion, but said, this is what happened today. We believed it.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we get to choose what we believe.
Yeah.
You're in communications. We can modify how we receive communications in a way that creates two separate universes, very believable on each end.
Yeah.
Unreconcilable in some ways because each says, well, it's toxic and they're the ones to what this gentleman is saying.
Yeah.
You have 4 minutes or you can come back, but I'll let you have the 4 minutes first.
So let me just say, first of all, as a communications person and media relations person, I have this discussion constantly with my friends in the media. Conflict sells. Conflict sells. We cover conflict, we don't cover resolution. In our office, I can get coverage on any lawsuit that I file. I don't get coverage of its resolution. Part of this is, when you start covering conflict, the best way to exemplify the conflict is to find the people at each outer edge, not the people who are in the middle struggling to try to find information and answers. That's hard. And it is exacerbated by the fact that we are in a world in which we're given a permission structure to only listen to and believe the people who say the same thing that we do. We all climb in the bubble, and it doesn't matter who we are, which side we're on, or even if it's the bubble that doesn't want anything from the outside. We all find a way to tune all of that out and to not sort of let in opposing viewpoints, opposing sides, or opposing perspectives. And I think that what this has wrought in that way is this focus again on what is our differences, right? It is the idea that we are and you hear this occasionally, right? Oh my God, we don't even have the same news sources. We don't even have the same version of the truth. Here's the truth. There have been people throughout society who have believed that the earth is flat. We don't treat them as though they are subhuman or we can't talk to them or we shouldn't be attempting to demonstrate scientific fact to them. We just recognize that this exists. Of course, there are people who disagree with us. There are people who disagree with me. There are people in my own home who disagree with me, even after 30 years. the point is that, by gosh, if I don't have to go home and justify that to my wife or to my niece or to my son or to anyone else, what's the point of this exercise? If I can't do that, if we can't talk about what we believe and share it in a way that is concise, that is accessible, that is understandable, and not accusatory, what are we doing? What are we doing? You know, I think I told this story the last time I was here, but you know, I'm old, and if I've forgotten, you might have as well. And I want to come back to kind of where I started. I grew up in this little town, and I had my best friend growing up. Our families were like, you know, that thing. I mean, like we were just, you know, we grew up together, right? And his older brother and my older brother were the same age. And my friend and two of his brothers have left town and moved. His brother stayed there, and you know, I left. And so over the years, my friend's brother and I have sort of come to different political places. And a few years ago, we were working on an issue including that talked about transgender rights for a student. And my friend's brother reached out to me, got my number from his brother, and said, you know, Ed, I know what you're working on. I know the things you do. And he said, I don't often agree with you, but he said, I just can't understand this. I just can't understand it. And, you know, I remember thinking when I first got the first text message, I thought to myself, now here's a choice, right? I can just go, we're not going to agree. You're wrong. I'm right. Let's move on. And instead I wrote back and said, what don't you understand? Tell me what you're thinking and why it matters. And that started a sporadic, weird text message exchange that lasted for 18 months. At the end of which he said to me, you know, as a parent, I understand what you're doing. And it was not until he said that, number one, that I began to understand that everybody was a parent in these situations, and you had to be open and recognize the interests that people had in that way. But it also showed me again that if we just talk to one another, if we just listen, if we just think, it wasn't that he had some information that was wrong. It's just he had information he didn't know. But he knew that he was a parent. He knew who he was as a person. And I think that's the thing that around all of these issues that I want to connect to. I don't want to yell and I don't want to scream. I can do that. You know, I don't want to say who's wrong and who's right. I have views on all that. But what I've figured out is that the way we get through all of these things is by talking to one another and looking for that common humanity. And if we can find that, I think there's actually a chance we can get through both this moment we're in and get to something better on the other side.
Ed Yohnka, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have to have you back.
All right.